Welcome to the module entitled You Received a Dyslexia Diagnosis. Now what? Before we jump into this module completely, I'd like to do a quick check in regarding the last module, Diagnosing Dyslexia. So let's get into it. Okay, number one, and you can just write this on a piece of paper in front of you or just keep it in your mind, just your memory. Number one, in most cases, who can diagnose dyslexia? A, teachers, B, pediatricians, C, neuropsychologist, psychologist, or school psychologist, D, all of the above. Number two, true or false? During an evaluation, the evaluator conducts many different tests to determine what is going on with my child. Number three, true or false? I should keep notes about the evaluation process starting from the first request for an evaluation. How do we do? Let's see. All right. So, number one, in most cases, the only types of uh, professionals who can diagnose dyslexia is a neuropsychologist, psychologist, school psychologist, or something similar to that. Normally, teachers and pediatricians cannot diagnose dyslexia. True or false? It is true that during an evaluation, the evaluator will conduct many different tests. We call this a battery of tests because they need to rule out certain things as well as explore various facets of what we see as deficits in a dyslexia diagnosis. Because remember, the definition of dyslexia is, trouble reading. A child who has the intelligence to be a much better reader is struggling with reading, so they're trying to figure out why. And then number three, yes, this is true. You should keep notes about the evaluation process for a couple different reasons. One, you're going to have a lot of information thrown at you in a relatively short amount of time. And so you'll want to be able to go back and reference those notes. And number two, if you are getting an evaluation through your school, as you will recall, there is a timeline or a stopwatch that starts as soon as you request an evaluation. And that's individual for each state. So make sure that you Google in your particular state what that timeline looks like. All right, let's get into the new module. And as a way to frame our conversation in this particular module, I want to tell you a story from Glennon Doyle's book, Untamed. And I think it works so beautifully in this discussion about parents' roles in big life situations that affect their family and children, and more specific to our conversation when a child receives a dyslexia diagnosis. In her book, Glennon was talking about a recent divorce, and she called a friend to see if they could offer some advice to her as she tried to navigate this process, or what she referred to as a crisis, with her children. Here's what her friend said: Glennon, your family is together on an airplane right now, and there's some serious turbulence. The kids are afraid. And what do we do when we're afraid on an airplane? We look at the flight attendants. If they seem scared, we panic too. If they seem calm, we stay calm. So, what I'm telling you is that you are the flight attendant in this scenario, and you've been through enough turbulence to know you all can make it. Your kids are new to flying. Excuse me. So they're going to look to you to see whether you're okay. Your job right now is to stay calm, smile, and keep serving the freaking peanuts. End quote. And then Glennon goes on to write, quote, life is not safe. And so our task is not to promise our kids there will be no turbulence. It's to assure them that when the turbulence comes, we will all hold hands and get through it together. We do not promise them a heartache free life, but we do assure them that the slings and arrows won't kill them. In fact, they will make them kinder, wiser, more resilient. We look them right in the eye, point them to their pain, and say, don't be afraid, baby. You were born to do this. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this module: how we continue to, quote unquote, serve the peanuts for our children. By now, you know me. I have a background in psychology and have worked in the mental health field, and I also have a background in education and have worked with kids of all ages. I am a firm believer in being straightforward with kids, sharing age appropriate information, but doing so in a no nonsense manner. Our kids are way smarter than we give them credit for. They can sense things even when we try to hide it. So, with this in mind, when we talk about a dyslexia diagnosis, the very first thing my mind goes to is when and how to tell the child or children in our lives. Before we get into the next slide, I want to give you a warning that if you're listening to this where your child can hear it, I would advise that you pause it and go get a headset before you continue on. Okay, So, as is common in the online groups I'm a part of, a parent asked if they should tell their child about their dyslexia diagnosis. I wanted to present some parents' feedback on the subject in their own words. In the top left hand corner, you'll notice one parent points out their own struggle and stated, "Had I known myself, I think life would have made much more sense to me as to why learning seemed to be harder for me than my peers." Lower left hand corner, a parent mentions how her daughter was diagnosed in second grade. She stated giving her a name allowed her to understand how her brain works and how to advocate for her needs better. On the right hand side, we have another parent who strongly recommends telling your child about their diagnosis. She stated, "Let's face it, he knows he's different from the other kids, and he knows there's a reason he had the assessment. So isn't it better to explain to him rather than have him think he's stupid?" Not telling him suggests it's something to be ashamed of or to hide. She goes on to give an example of how she told her 9-year-old in the positive light that she put it in. For example, you know how you're super good at Lego and building things and anything 3D, you're really creative and great at problem solving? Well, I found out today the reason is you have a dyslexic brain. I also have a couple more to share. The sentiment shared in the comment on the top is one I see quite often. In this particular case, the parent mentioned the child doesn't have a diagnosis, but a documentary she was watching about dyslexia resonated with her child, and she stated suddenly he, meaning her child, didn't feel alone anymore. This is critical. In fact, when I ask someone with dyslexia in my life what they believe are the most important things to share with parents in this course who are facing a dyslexia diagnosis, the number one most important thing they shared was to remind parents to make sure their child knows that they aren't alone in the journey. And I'm sure if you think about any really hard time you've had, you probably got through it or would have gotten through it better had you known you weren't alone in the struggle. I think that's a very real human experience. Feeling like someone is there with you as you navigate hard times can make all the difference. And then finally, the comment at the bottom, although it's quite blunt, I find great value in what this parent wrote. This parent stated that it's 1,000 times better to know you are dyslexic than to think you are dumb. I couldn't agree more. Remember, our children, if left to assume, may assume they just aren't smart when this simply isn't the case. Remember, these responses are from real parents who are sharing their experience in hopes that it helps someone else in their journey. And it's for these reasons that I shared that I 100% believe you disclose your child's diagnosis. So, when do we do it then? Well, most importantly, it has to be after you've had a chance to digest the news first. Because remember, we can't really be there for someone else unless we have really come into and accepted, maybe not even accepted is the right word because it's a process, right? And we'll talk more about that in the next module. But you need to be able to give yourself time and space first before you then are there for your child. It's important that you tell your child in a calm environment that's free from distractions, if at all possible. You'll also want to pick a time that isn't right before you have to be somewhere else, whether it's school, extracurriculars, or an event, even if it's a fun event. You want to make sure that you have enough time to process the information with the child for as long as it takes, or as long as they want or need. In order to feel okay with what's going on. And this will be a process, but it's good it's better not to rush. "Hey, you have dyslexia. Okay, let's move it along." Okay, so now that you know when, it's the how, right? As I've stated, I find with almost anything, directness is best. You don't want to sugarcoat it. You don't want to beat around the bush. Clear is kind, as Brene Brown says. So sit down with your child and ask them if they remember the assessment that they took. Let them know you received the results back and that you want to share the results with them. Before you explain that they have dyslexia, remind them how smart they are. It's important they realize their dyslexia has absolutely nothing to do with their intelligence, that they are very bright, but their brains need to learn to read in a slightly different way. Then let them know that they have dyslexia. Explain what dyslexia is and isn't, and remind them that you will be with them every step of the way. So, what this might look like, for example, is, you know, hey, dyslexia has nothing to do with how smart you are, but it does affect your reading and language abilities. You can still become an amazing reader and writer, but you just need the right kind of instruction to make sure you get all the skills that you need. Also, just for parents out there who find that they also are dyslexic, being as this is a hereditary condition, you may want to share, your experience, or if someone close to you, a sibling or an aunt or uncle, something like that, share if they had difficulty learning to read as well, because that helps the child know that they're not alone as well. Then you'll want to ask to see if your child has any questions. And listen, parents, it's okay to not have all the answers. There are many times that I didn't have all the answers, but there's a real power in saying, I'm not sure. Why don't we look it up together? Why don't we find out together? And then remember to end the conversation with the fact that you love them, and that's because, as we stated earlier, you never want the child to be left to assume something, because if left to assume, they may think that this diagnosis will change your feelings or thoughts about them. And we really don't want that. Okay, now that we've brought the most important person into the fold, that is your child, we can talk about how to support your child. Let's briefly touch base to make sure we're all working under the same appreciation for and understanding of special education services in school. You may feel a certain way regarding hearing the term special education or intervention services. I have found that there can be a stigma regarding special education services, especially among people my age, Gen X or older. Um, However, what I've come to know and fully appreciate are the intervention specialists and special education teachers who work with children like mine. They truly want to help students like ours as best they can. Many may not know exactly what your child needs because dyslexia in general and Orton Gillingham based methods specifically aren't as well known as you may think they are. But that doesn't mean you can't request these types of services. In fact, you already know it's critical to ask for these specific types of programs or instruction, because without it, our children won't learn to read as efficiently as they um, would probably be able to do otherwise. Special ed teachers are as close to heaven as I have found, and special education will help provide the support your child needs in the form of remediation and accommodations, among other things. These things will help level the playing field for neurodivergent kids who struggle so much to do what many children can do almost effortlessly. What hurts me is hearing from parents who don't want to get their children support because many wrongfully assume doing so teaches their child that life is easy when it's not. If you're a parent who is concerned with this, trust me, even with the supports, school isn't easy for our children. It's just not as hard as it would be without these supports. These school-based resources and supports cannot be put into place though unless you ask the school to do so. I'm not going to go too deeply into this because we covered how to do that in the last module. Just know your child can't get an IEP or 504 plan without you reaching out to the school to inquire about it. Okay, so let's get to those educational supports. Here I'm going to offer definitions for these terms, but I'm not going to give you a list of specific accommodations your child could have. There's good reason for all of this. All children are different and all needs are different. You can't use a one size fits all approach here, and you also shouldn't be afraid to ask for what your child really needs. Conversely, you don't need to throw everything but the kitchen sink into the 504 IEP, because more isn't always better here. Most often it's not. You want to find that sweet spot where your child is supported but not inundated with supports that distract from the real learning and space and time they need with material that is created with them in mind. Let me give you a quick example of how this can snowball quickly. My child, who was getting outside tutoring, was then provided a computer-based OG program to work in. It was overkill and it didn't help him. He was already getting tutoring, and then on top of his regular schoolwork demands, they also wanted him to do a computer-based program. It just didn't make sense for him and his learning, so we cut it. Accommodations allow, let's get into the terms. So accommodations allow students to complete the same task as their neurotypical peers, but with some variation in time, format, setting, and or presentation. For example, if the class has 5 paragraphs to write, your child may have less. Why? Because students with dyslexia have to use 5 times the area of their brain as their non-dyslexic peers, as we've talked about earlier in this course. Decoding and encoding is hard work. The work is still challenging will still challenge them, but it's not so challenging that they are set up to fail from jump. This still allows your child the opportunity to show what they know and what they can do, but it isn't insurmountable in size. I hope that makes sense. While school will more often than not select accommodations that start least invasive than more invasive, that in and of itself shouldn't be cause for concern because it is worth paying attention to and checking in about regularly to see if the accommodations are helping your child. If it's not enough support, you can always request more help and assistance or resources that will actually help. There are also modifications teachers can make to assignments. Unlike accommodations where the instructional level and content is the same as all other students in the class, with modifications, there may be changes made to what the student is expected to learn, and these are based on their individual abilities. For example, rewording questions in more simple language, or using an alternate book. We haven't had that personally, so I can't really speak to that any more than just telling you what it is. Next up, remediation. This process is used to rebuild or strengthen particular skills. For example, our children often need additional practice with spelling or letter patterns or phonemes, etc. The goal of remediation is to shore up any missed or weak knowledge our students may have because remember, everything builds. In language, you have to have the fundamentals first, phonemes, individual sounds. If not, if you start building on a crumbling foundation, the whole house is going to fall or cave in. Tutoring. Tutoring can help accelerate the learning and educational growth process for your child. However, I have a huge caveat here. You do not want your child to get one type of instruction in school and a different type of instruction in tutoring. Why? Because it can be confusing. The goal is to have the school give the child what they need educationally, and what they need educationally is proven instruction that is research and evidence based. The issue is that more often than not, there are fully trained teachers in our public schools. There are not, sorry, more often than not, there are not fully trained teachers in our public schools to offer this type of instruction. So often parents are left to scramble to make up the difference. So what I suggest that you do is if you do go with tutoring, I suggest that you talk with your tutor specifically to figure out if it will confuse your child. But more often than not, most professionals will recommend that you do not offer two different types of Orton Gillingham programs because it can be confusing. Now let's switch gears from educational supports to social and emotional supports. As I stated earlier, it's extremely important to make sure you tell your child that you will be with them every step of the way and remind them of this often. Extracurriculars are a great way for your child to find those activities they naturally excel at, or excel in, or enjoy. While I hope you get lucky early on in this process of finding the activity your child loves, don't be discouraged if it takes time. Extracurriculars can get costly, but that doesn't mean you can't find something your child enjoys. For example, we've paid for rock climbing classes and jujitsu, but we've also had just as much fun exploring local parks or visiting library events or rollerblading in our neighborhood. The goal is to help your child find meaning and something they enjoy outside of school. Along the same lines, it's really important for us as parents to focus on our child's strengths and, if possible, use those strengths to overcome challenges. My son loves technology and science in general, so I let him ask Google anything he wants. I've showed him how to use voice to text on my phone, his iPad, and even on the computer. He also loves science, so, we use that love of science to find books that he will enjoy reading to practice his reading. And finally, I may be alone here, and believe me, this was a huge step for me as a former perfectionist, but I personally don't care about what grades my children bring home. Having worked in education at all levels, K through college, and worked in environments where people I worked with didn't attend college and also did attend college, I know intelligence isn't reflected in grades. It's reflected in curiosity and a lifelong love of learning. If you can stoke those fires, your child will do just fine. I know as parents, we get caught up on, well, if my child doesn't have good grades, how will they ever go to college and get a good job? First, there are amazing jobs that pay very well and provide great meaning to workers who do the jobs that don't require college. I'm not saying, well, let's keep going. Secondly, if your child wants to go to college, there are numerous avenues to get there. Will it be an Ivy League college with scholarships? Maybe, but maybe not. But that doesn't mean our children can't be successful. Additionally, as our society has turned into a gig economy and there are numerous resources out there to allow you to do basically anything, what has become increasingly clear is that no matter what the interest, there is a way to make a profit off of it or to make it happen, make your dreams happen. You just have to find out how, and lucky for us, we have the most brilliant problem solvers around, our children with dyslexia. At the end of the day, I've worked with hundreds of kids and adults, and what makes someone successful isn't a piece of paper on the wall. It's their proclivity for learning, curiosity, and working smarter, not harder. Now, I say all of that, and I know maybe some parents are like, "Whoa, you're just giving up!" Like, no, I want my child to go to college, and I want them to be a doctor, and I want them to be a lawyer. Great, those are great ones. I approach it much more from a student driven approach. What does the student want? And of course, those interests will change over time. What a third grader wants is going to be drastically different than what an 18-year-old wants out of their future. Your goal is to just shepherd them through the process and support them through the process. What I'm getting at here is that too often we as parents get caught up in every single grade in every single class. And we think if it's not an A, are they even, we're very, we can be very dichotomic or, what is the word I'm thinking of? Like a either or in our thinking, very black and white. If they get a bad grade in a class, they get a bad grade in a class. It's one class. It's not the rest of their lives. So I just want to provide some perspective here as someone who has worked with all levels of education, it's going to be okay. And there are amazingly bright, very gifted students with dyslexia who may love an Ivy League college. And conversely, they may not. So it's just, I just want you to have a little bit perspective that a love of learning really will take them extremely far. We can't really talk about accommodations, remediation, IEPs, or 504 plans without the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA as it's commonly referred to. I have a link to terms that are helpful to know if and when you enter the world of special education. It's helpful to know these terms so that you can feel empowered to advocate for your child. Some key takeaways from this link below: review the list of terms before special education meetings to refresh your memory. Not all of the terms will that you see on the page will apply to students. And ask the IEP team to explain any terms you don't understand. This is huge. Don't feel intimidated. Ask them if you're not sure. Okay, so we just talked in general terms about how you can support your child educationally and socially slash emotionally. But if you're like me, you may be itching for some practical skills that you can use immediately. So we'll get to those. And I think a great opener to those skills is this quote from Ben Foss. As a reminder, he's the author of the Dyslexia Empowerment Plan. He also has severe dyslexia, but he's like a doctor. He went through all kinds of different college programs. He's got a lot of different degrees. Okay. A child with dyslexia will never eye read as well as his peers, and that I hope to reassure you is fine. Yet all children need to be exposed to vocabulary and ideas to be successful in school. If your child was blind, providing text as audiobooks or braille would allow her to read with her ears or with her fingers. No one would ever claim that a blind person was lazy or stupid for not reading text with her eyes. When I listen to audio that's ear reading, when I speed it up to 400 words words a minute, 4 times the pace of standard speech, I am leveling the playing field for me. It's not what the mainstream conceives of as reading, but it's ear reading, it's learning, it's literacy. And if you've read his book, you may already know this, but if not, he figured out that he would need to jack up the speed in most of his textbooks because he was going through law school. And so there was a lot of reading in law school. So that's how he learned to basically speed read. I think it's important to have the proper mindset when you think about learning and how it may or may not differ for your particular child. For example, my son needs a tremendous amount of support in writing and reading and needs a steady flow of reminders because his working memory just isn't the best. While both need a tremendous amount of emotional support while learning, my son suffered greatly while we were searching for an explanation of why he was having such a hard time in school. So I find he needs a little bit more support during homework or, school time in general. My daughter doesn't have as strong of a deficit in her working memory. So while she does need reminders, she more often than not, wants to kind of search for the answers within. So, she just wants time to kind of sit with it and then it'll kind of pop in her brain. Her memory is much stronger and her drive is a little stronger to do things for herself as well. Before we move on, this is a probably a great time to offer the reminder that when all of us learn, we are in a very vulnerable place. We need to remember this personally, but also as parents for our children. Give yourself and your child grace when learning or doing something for the first handful of times, maybe even more, because research has shown for quite some time that people do not learn well when stressed or anxious. In a moment, I'm going to share some practical things that you can do to support your child. But before I get to that, I wanted to share a few terms, most of which I had to figure out myself when my children were first learning to read. I think sometimes people who teach think we all know what they know, and these words I did not know, but it seemed like I was expected to know. And so a lot of these, if you are a parent of an older child, these you may already know these words, but if you are a parent of a younger child, I think this is going to be extremely helpful. Okay, so you may have heard the term CVC words. These are words that follow a pattern of consonant, then a vowel, then a consonant. So think of bat, mop, sip, den. Um, and then decode, that means to break a word down into its individual letter sounds. So den, we would break it down to d, e, n, den, to figure out what the individual letter sounds are. Blending is taking those individual letter sounds and forming them into word, blending them together to form the word. So going back to the example den, as a student, I would say d, e, n. And then if you tell me to blend, I'm going to say den, den. Decoding, essentially at its most simplest terms, is reading. Encoding, in its simplest term, is spelling. Vowels, please don't think I'm insulting your intelligence. I know you all know what vowels are, but this was important to point out. Vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. Make sure you know exactly how to pronounce the short and long vowel sounds in order to help your child. This is huge because if you're like me, when I started this journey several years ago, I had to make sure that I knew exactly how to say the short vowel sounds because for instance, if you're a neurotypical and you learn to read without really struggling, you may not even think to slow down and really think about the individual sounds. So something that can be helpful is having a keyword for each of the vowels. This is what tutors do. So for apple, for A, it would be apple. E would have edge, I, itch, octopus, upper, or up. Vowels don't always make their short or long sound. This may be mind blowing for a few of you, but there are several different sounds they can make, and this is why reading English is so difficult. But just for example, there's a thing called a schwa, and that's basically when we say when certain vowel sounds say And then consonants. Make sure you know exactly how to pronounce each consonant. excuse me. Do not add after each letter sounds. So it's not for let's say bat. It's not b a t. It's b a t. Very short. And even the ones that can even the sounds that can last a little bit longer. I don't say ma ah. I say ah. And it might be hard to hear. You can't see my face as I'm saying these things, um, these particular sounds, so it might be hard to hear in my microphone. But just make sure you can Google this, but just make sure you don't add an because then you're actually teaching your child that, let's say the letter B, for example, says you're teaching them by adding an that it would say two sounds, b uh buh, buh, Do you hear what I'm saying? I hope this all makes sense. Okay, and then as we transition into the next list, I just want to provide this, disclaimer. I can't provide an exhaustive list of what you should or shouldn't do, and that's for a couple different reasons. I don't know the age or grade level of your child. I don't know the ability level or specific areas for concern your child has, and I can't possibly summarize what a dyslexia practitioner, specialist, or OG tutor does because it's a lot. While I personally love the challenge of simplifying complex concepts, that is, if I can understand the concept, this isn't one that you can really boil down to easy everyday steps you can do with your child. As you already know from earlier modules, the Orton-Gillingham approach starts with the most common aspect of language and builds to the least common. All along the way, it's explicitly taught and it's diagnostic to the student being served. As a parent, you have a unique perspective and can see many of the holes, and that's helpful when working with your child. You know if they're having issues with, for instance, the sound or confusing it with sound. You can work on that with them a little bit more because you will have seen it a little bit more, say, for instance, when you're working on homework. Okay. So I have these practical skills and it's a couple different slides, so just bear with me. Um, so you'll want to read with your child every day. You've probably already heard this. Now, reading to your child every day is not going to quote unquote I don't even want to use that term. It's not going to diminish the problems with dyslexia. It just won't. You can't read your way out of dyslexia. You need specific instructions. So it's not enough to read to your child every day. You will really need to look into OG based services. But that said, reading with your child is a great way to bond. It's a great way to give them practice with words. Um, and it doesn't just have to be them reading to you, it can be a mixture. It can be you reading to them reading to you, or you guys reading together. So here are some things to think about. When reading, try to find decodable readers that are right for their reading level. And how do you determine that, right? Because we're not teachers, or maybe some of you are, I don't know. But one way to determine a child's correct reading level is to use the 5-finger rule. This is how it works. Your child opens a book to the first page. They read the page and hold up one finger for every word they don't know or can't pronounce. The number of fingers they're holding up by the end of the page tells them if the book is the right level. So if they're only holding up 0 to 1 fingers, it's 0 to 1 finger, it's too easy. If it's 2 to 3 fingers, it's just right. If it's 4 to 5 fingers, it's too hard. So it's best to read that out loud with a buddy, or maybe you read it to them as they follow along. Make sure that you put your finger under the word. It's helpful even for older students. And you know your child. More often than not, older children will not want to do this, but it is so helpful because it helps train their eye to go across. And as they're reading, you can put your finger underneath it or above it, either way you want to do it, and you don't move your finger on through the sentence if they get the word wrong. You just stay there and give them time to figure out what that word is. Next, if your child struggles, you can read first and then allow them to repeat it back to you. That allows them to kind of see the word. It's multisensory in its approach anyway. They are looking at the word, they are hearing you say it, and then they get to say it. And then break multisyllabic words or syllabic words down into their smaller parts. So if it's a very long word, you'll want to make sure that you make it as manageable as possible for them. Mississippi, Mississippi. Make sure, because that makes it less overwhelming for the student or the child. Decode as much of those sight or high frequency words as you can, and then discuss how one or more of the letters aren't acting as they should. This goes back to the vowels. They act up, for lack of a better term. There's numerous reasons why they do that, and most of it is based on etymology. But for now, all you need to know is that a lot of sight words and high frequency, what are called sight and high frequency words, can be decoded. And so it's easier to kind of let the child decode the word so that they can learn it a little bit easier than just saying, hey, remember it. Because remember, our students' working memories are not great. Rote memorization is extremely hard for our students. They need um, to put it within a context or a story, something like that to help them remember things. Okay, what's next? Also, you can use multisensory techniques. I don't want you to overthink it. Just try to find examples for your child to use as many senses as possible. So here's an example. When sounding out a word, move whatever you have. If you have blocks, Legos, whatever small little thing, it can even be checkers. Move a, Lego up for each um oh, I said each work. Sorry. Each sound. So, let's go back to our den example. So you would say duh, the first sound, and move the checker up. Then you'd say eh, and you move the checker up. And then you'd say and you'd move the checker up. And then say each sound again, duh, eh, n. Then blend together, den. Then say the word fast, den, and then write the word. So you have lots of different inputs going in at the same time. It's multisensory and it helps them to retain the information. Create opportunities for your child to build their vocabulary and to read age-appropriate stories. And you can do this by listening to audiobooks. I just want to pause. This is a great skill and something that people don't talk about enough. A lot of times as parents, especially if it's a young child who is struggling, we just want to give them, or not even a young, like as they get into third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, they have interests that are well beyond Sally sees a cat. That's boring to them. While they need the remediation, and that may be their reading level, we can still build in opportunities for them to build an appropriate vocabulary for their age and their grade. And also, it gives them an opportunity to read stories that align with where they are chronologically and with grade level, all of that interest, and in addition, also. So you can listen to audiobooks. You can do it free through a couple different ways. The library has audiobooks usually on CD. The Libby app, which you've heard me talk about this multiple times, I love it so much. That is free, and that's a digital download. However, there can be a wait time for some. So you have to kind of plan ahead there. And then there's Learning Ally. That is not free. You have to pay for it. And students have to have an IEP. I don't know if it can be a 504, but I do know an IEP will get you the service, but you still have to pay for it. And it's, I think, around $120 a year. So it is pricey, but Learning Ally works, as opposed to Libby just listening to it. Learning Ally, you actually have the book and then it reads it to you, so they can get two inputs. They can follow along with their eyes and look at it while they hear it. And then practice, 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 review, review, review. I know if you are like me, you have heard this multiple times from their teachers who don't understand just how much you're doing. I know how much you're doing. I know that you're reading to your child. I know that you're doing those flashcards. I know that it's frustrating. I've been there. I have been there. Um, But any way that you can practice, it doesn't have to be just reading a book. It can be while you're driving around town doing errands. You can say a word and tell them to tell you what letters are in it, or you can say, "Hey, look at that sign. Can you read it to me?" Or I'm going to say, these sounds. You blend it into a word. We used to do that all the time while we were just driving around, or while we were driving around, we would listen to audiobooks. Then you can focus on the road. They can focus on the story. They stay quiet. It's great. Um, Ask your child's teacher if there are topics or concepts you can review with your child. So this is supplemental, right? If there, okay, this should come with a disclaimer. I know that you're already busy. So if you are already busy, just stay the course. Do the homework, work with your child, do what you can. Don't overwhelm yourself. You don't have to do it all. Let me just make sure that I give you permission. If no one else does in your life, I'm giving you permission to just do your best, okay? Because that's all we can do. If you find that your child has the ability or time to do more, they have appropriate balance between, school and fun and playing with their friends, but you're also seeing that they still have some leftover time and you'd like to just give them a little bit more support, ask their teacher if they have things that you can be reviewing with your child. And then if your child is in tutoring, ask if there's anything you could be reviewing or practicing in between tutoring sessions. I know for me, I have specific pages, it's extra practice that parents can go over, and it doesn't take more than 5 minutes. And I say that as a parent of two dyslexic children. I mean it when I say it doesn't take more than 5 minutes. We often get, oh, this homework will only take 20 minutes, but it takes 2 hours. So, but I'm being serious. Okay. Um, and then let's talk about writing too, okay? So our kids need immense help with that as well. That can really be a point of anxiety. I know it was and still is, anxiety provoking for my kids. So you'll want to practice writing when the stakes aren't high. I'm talking summer. I'm talking if they want to write the lemonade stand sign or write their name over and over again, or, they want to list their favorite things. Those are when you want to practice writing. Of course, you'll get the practice on homework, but it's much easier to work with your child when you're not under the gun of a homework deadline. Okay. A paper in school, you're doing much more than just practicing writing. You're thinking about the concepts, you're thinking of a web map, you're thinking of, I need, three main ideas and three supporting ideas under each one. And it gets into a whole thing. That's not the best time to learn. You'll still have to do it, right? But it's easier to practice your writing when the stakes aren't high. If you're new to practicing writing, you may want to look into Handwriting Without Tears or the Institute for Excellence in Writing, IEW. You will probably see, if you are in any dyslexia group, you will hear that IEW thrown around quite often. A lot of our kids will get that through a tutor, in addition to like Orton Gillingham based services. And that's because it teaches them not only how to write the letters, but how you write in general, like what to write. And I mentioned this too, so down below, but it's not just how you write, it's also what you write that is important, especially as they get up in the upper ages. If you have, primary aged kids, it's not as critical, but, nearing middle school and definitely into middle school and then high school, it's important to know, how you concept map and the tools, that they need to show your child what to write. And then, oh, yes. Before we end, I wanted to end with this, because I think too often, at least, you know what? Let me say from my example, or from my perspective, I can get caught up. I know I just gave you, like 3 or 4 slides of, oh, you could practice this and do that. It may feel overwhelming to you, and I understand that. And I just want you to know that dyslexia is an island of weakness surrounded by a sea of strengths. This is what Sally Shaywitz wrote, and it's so true. You may get caught up with all of the, oh my gosh, we've got to remediate this and we need to work on that and we need to do all of it. Pause, focus on the strengths, or at least have a balance between strengths and areas that you have to work on. Because otherwise, it will feel like a never ending, like that you're on a treadmill or you're on a wheel just running and really getting nowhere. But I promise you, any effort you put in will be worth it in the long run. Okay, so the next module is my favorite. It is the parent empowerment portion of the entire course. So I hope that you will join me over there.